This loner loser, who is still not lacking in looks, lives in a world where the game is superior to all creatures, and at a certain point determines the profession of a player in the same game. His name is Joe, and he has become a thief, but not a simple one. He has received abilities unknown to anyone before that allow him to steal skills from his enemies. After all, he is now the target of many people. But let's go back to the continuation of the last part. Somewhere in the depths of space, where many stars have been extinguished, there is a blue star surrounded by the likes of the rings of Saturn, but still Earth, or in other words, a world parallel to Earth. 100 years ago, a game called Dawn came to this blue star. Amidst hordes of monsters, battles, you needed to survive. And the only way to do that was to awaken your profession and become a master. You could be anything you wanted to be, a warrior, an angel, a mage, or even an elf. And afterward, one could enter the world of Dawn, beginning to fight monsters and improve until you became the strongest. At this time, one girl was standing over a magic stone that filled her with a strange purple-colored energy, and the person observing this stated that Song Xiaoli had successfully awakened, obtaining the profession of master blacksmith. At this time, a group of friends mocked this Song Xiaoli, for everyone knows that awakening to the qualities of a blacksmith is the epitome of worthlessness, since in the early stages, her skills can only be improved by buying incredibly expensive materials. In that case, the examiner told this bunch of idiots to shut up, and then he called out the next person named Wang Tianqi. Afterwards, the big guy with red hair climbed up on the pedestal, smiling as he stood in his cool stance. The profession stone filled Wang Tianqi with energy, and then the examiner congratulated Wang Tianqi, saying that he had successfully awakened to the paladin profession. Then the red-haired JoJo dude started slicking his hair back with a pompous face, not paying attention to the people around him. A bunch of idiots started praising their brother Van, saying that paladin is a very rare profession. One of them remarked that it was no surprise that they were talking about brother Van. After the inspector took out his glasses and started to check his sheet, preparing to call the next one, the checker called out Zhou Yi, where a guy with long hair and obviously very tall appeared and immediately announced that he was here, attracting the attention of the people around him. Zhou Yi pompously approached the crystal and touched the crystal. He began to extract dark energy from it, and then there was a dark burst of energy enveloping the entire space around. After that, the silhouette of a thief appeared on the dark stone, and the inspector said loudly that Zhou Yi had obtained the profession of a thief. After Zhou and himself began to be covered with dark energy, and all others around admired Zhou, for thief is a rare profession, a person with this profession can steal items and cause enormous damage to a single target and even become invisible. At this time, the fat guy eating his chips said that Zhou didn't know how to use a thief's weapon anyway, and that he was useless even after waking up. Another of the bunch of idiots also shouted that this guy had practiced with a two-handed sword earlier because he wanted to become a warrior, so now his face looked ridiculous. A bunch of idiots kept trying to provoke Zhou, shouting that he was useless to the profession now. Even if he started practicing now, he would only be of any use in a year and a half. Another idiot said that he probably wouldn't last even a minute at the entry level. After Zhou activated the system window and began to scrutinize the system window. The thing is that each profession has a unique skill that distinguishes them from each other. Usually a thief has a skill called Death Stare that allows him to see through the vulnerability of the enemy, dealing a net damage of 100% based on 5 seconds. However, before Zhou appeared another skill called the Hand of God. This active skill allows you to steal from the enemy something from things, skills, or attributes, and this hand can be used up to 2 times on a single target, visually activating the Hand of God. Zhou began to look at it carefully, realizing that this skill should not be a skill that ordinary thieves have, for after all, ordinary thieves can only steal gold. But the Hand of God can even steal items, skills, and attributes. This is too cool compared to the guy's expectations. In addition, Zhou discovered a passive skill that does not look so very useless. It is a master of weapons that allows unlimited use of any weapon. Imagining himself from the outside, Zhou realized that perhaps this skill could help him become a thief with a two-handed sword, which looks quite strange. After Joe, a little thought, realized that except for the passive skill related to weapons, the hand of a god is not a skill of an ordinary thief. It turns out that Joe now has an ace up his sleeve. In the next moment, the inspector turned to the younger Joe, put his hand on his shoulder, and said that he should not listen to this nonsense. He also remembered that Joe still had time to pass the test for beginners, so Joe should go and familiarize himself with the profession of a thief afterwards. Joe immediately realized that the examiner was right. Smiling and turning to the inspector, he addressed him as a teacher and asked him not to worry, for Joe himself still could not understand how he had managed to awaken a rare profession, for many people wanted it but could not get it. Putting his hands in his pocket, Joe turned to the crowd of foolish schoolchildren. Looking at them, he thought about the test for the newcomers, mentally promising the schoolchildren that he would show them how to pass it. One of his classmates shouted at him that Joe must be joking, because no one cared about his shitty profession, since in theory a common thief could only hide as a scout. Frick asked Joe if he realized that he couldn't compare to their classmate who had gotten the paladin class. In general, the freaks followed Joe to the end, advising him not to show up in the game anymore because their brother Wang, the most reliable paladin. But Joe's smile did not slip from his face. He mentally said that they should just wait and watch his progress. The system beeps in town. A window popped up stating that the nickname had been successfully set up. It was Joe who had been subjected to the system, which contacted the esteemed Mr. Death Star, asking him to create an avatar of his profile. Looking at the system window, Joe didn't take his eyes off of it, realizing that he could forget about his avatar. Because in the game, all thieves are disguised and can't be seen when they are in the game, Joe decided not to create a bicycle and just use his real face. Therefore, Joe swapped his hand to the right, deciding to skip creating an avatar. The system turned to Mr. Death Star again, prompting him to choose a weapon from the many available. Damn, I wish all RPGs did that. Of course, Joe immediately poked at the two-handed sword, smiling, then saying that a two-handed sword was every man's dream. After the character was created, his appearance appeared, and the system notified him that the Death Star would now begin the beginner's trial. A smile immediately appeared on Joe's face, and after the countdown, the system moved him to the starting level, assuring the player that the probability of passing at this point was 0%. After a while, Joe found himself in the middle of a dark forest during the night, accompanied by pixels carrying him into the game, and a huge two-handed dark sword could be seen behind him. Examining his hand, Joe opened his mouth in surprise, grinning at the fact that his outfit had changed due to the transference. Still, Joe realized it was a smart decision. At the same moment, Joe turned his head slightly, noticing that the system had notified him that the first wave of monsters was coming. Suddenly, the entire location began to be covered in red-colored pixels and shuttered the entire atmosphere. Joe immediately turned his head and saw that he was about to be attacked by hordes of monsters, namely goblins. The hungriest goblin immediately appeared. With drool in his teeth and possessed eyes, he prepared his bat, turning to Joe and saying that he should let him taste his own delicious blood and flesh. Joe smilingly began to pull out his huge two-handed sword, saying that the monsters came very timely. Now he decides to see how his exclusive skills obtained when gaining the class work. At one moment, Joe was preparing to attack the goblin. He realizes that in order to use his skill, he needs to wait until the goblin comes closer to attack. As soon as the goblin swung his bat at Joe, Joe continued to stand on his character and prepare to defend himself. Joe charged his hand after using the god's hand and reached forward, preparing to steal the skill. Still, the goblin had almost nothing, so Joe was lucky to get the great club weapon. This caused Joe's mood to change, pouting he didn't understand why he had gotten the baton. After all, it was most likely impossible to steal skills or attributes from the goblin. The goblin looked at his hands and couldn't understand where his baton had gone. But in addition to the usual goblin, there was another huge goblin who was also preparing to attack poor Joe. Joe also received a notification from the system that told him the essence of the God Hand skill. The point was that he could randomly decorate any of the skill items and attributes to prevent the real battle from starting. In response, Joe tearfully punctured this system window with his hand, saying that this skill seemed powerful to him, but it turns out to be just a deception, otherwise known as a candy with a pretty wrapper. At this moment, the huge goblin got angry at Joe and attacked him with shouts, causing Joe to stop fooling around and immediately change his face as he sensed the danger. Joe was able to defend against the huge goblin's attack with a small bat. He crossed it with the huge goblin's huge bat and realized that this hand of God was apparently not a reliable skill, and he needed to test his luck again on an exclusive skill. Joe used his death stare skill and his gaze changed. The death stare recreated a projection, showing Joe's vulnerability that would allow him to deal 100% true damage in 5 seconds. The goblin's weakness was on his head, so the system advised him to hit the goblin there with his two-handed blade. Joe loosened his grip, and because of that, the goblin was still able to finish his lunge, hitting the ground but not Joe. As Joe jumped back, the system reminded him again that the weapon master allowed him to use all kinds of weapons without any restrictions. As Joe successfully dodged, he was able to swing at the goblin from above again, preparing to strike it. The goblin remained puzzled. The next moment, Joe was able to hit the goblin so hard that a strange green slime came out of its face. The system also notified that Joe had hit the goblin in a vulnerable spot, and thanks to that, the damage was doubled. It surprised the smaller goblins, which is not strange, because imagine if your strongest friend was killed by the type you considered the weakest among you. Throwing out the broken battle, Joe turned to the goblins with a cold gaze. Thus he asked if he could really steal something from them twice each with his God hand skill. After a couple of seconds, Joe was destroying hordes of goblins in the blink of an eye and stealing attributes or batons from them. Alas, no skill was given. After a while, Joe was able to defeat a lot of goblins, and flipping through the system window, he stated that he understood everything. After analyzing his fight and the loot he received, he decided to use it along with the exclusive skills of a thief because for Joe, it seemed to be the most correct way to use the hand of a god. The system abruptly began to create red pixels and notified Joe with a loud sound that the second wave of goblins was coming, to which Joe immediately paid attention. In this regard, Joe began to pull out his two-handed sword, looking at the goblins, which were twice as many, and they were noticeably larger than the goblins of the first wave. Putting his blade forward, Joe began to charge it with dark energy. Smiling, he also asked the goblins to continue to go straight at him and die obediently. Hitting his blade on the floor, he then picked it up and began to be covered in more dark energy, informing the stupid goblins that this time he was going to be more serious. Joe raised his blade and then brought it down, creating a huge slash of darkness that in an instant scattered across the location and killed many goblins that were about to attack him. Continuing to slice the goblins like a chef, Joe continued to debate with himself, knowing full well that the stealing skill was unpredictable, and his high dexterity, combined with the high damage of the two-handed sword, allowed him to easily defeat the entry-level goblins. Joe defeated all the goblins and continued to use the system window, at the same time finding that his total stats after the battle managed to increase by 16 points, and also Joe managed to pump up to the second level. Joe's stats and moving on. Next should be the final boss. Standing in front of the location, Joe understood this. Rumor has it that he also remembered that this boss is so difficult that it is impossible to kill. At one point, a female voice came out who apparently liked role-playing games. He said that Joe should obey him. Joe looked around and couldn't figure out where the hell she was. At one moment, something soft touched Joe's back, which shocked him. This unusually large and soft creature called Joe Little Brother. Joe looked around and found a cat girl with dark purple hair who apparently escaped from the manhwa with a specific genre. This Dark Knight Dancer is a minor night demon with level 10, who not only has 2 skills. Joe immediately jumped back, his eyes frozen in fear, because Joe couldn't understand when the small night demon had appeared. The cat girl with a wry smile pointed her finger at Joe, indicating that the little thief with the two-handed sword jewelry looked funny. This made Joe silent for a moment and angry. He charged his right hand with energy and used his god hand on this dancer, which by the way seemed to surprise her. Joe decided to take the dancer by surprise with this attack, for he thought it was the right thing to do. With a catty smile, the girl turned around and asked Joe what he had done, for it had not caused her any damage. In that case, a system window appeared in front of Joe and explained that he had another chance to steal something from the same target. Joe continued to stare at his hand with a perplexed expression, realizing that last time he had gotten a club, and now for some damn reason he had gotten a ring. This really pissed off the girl. Judging by her face, she was ready to eat Joe immediately. She asked Joe where he got the ring from. Joe himself realized that he was in trouble because this cat girl was going to kill him. Looking at the skill cooldown slot, Joe gritted his teeth, realizing that he only had one chance, and for now he could only rely on himself and stall a bit until then. Joe put his hand forward so that the cat girl would notice it and began to praise the ring, saying that it was gorgeous. And this ring was perfect, especially when paired with a beauty like this girl. Cat girl smiled and blushed a little, hiding it with her hands. The cat girl said that he was right, and in fact, she was of the same opinion. In that case, Joe realized that he was doing something stupid and changed his face, but still asked the girl why he should return something if he stole it from her with his own skill. This made the girl's body begin to burn with a fierce red anger. Joe, in turn, justified his provocation by mentally explaining that he did it so that she would come closer to him and be within 2 meters. The cat girl immediately changed her face and then got into a fighting stance and began to release a huge red energy. Joe looked at the system window that notified him that the small night demon had gone into a rage, and now all the characteristics had increased by 30%. Joe realized that this was indeed the final phase with zero chance of passing, and this mere tension was making him gasp. But Joe's gaze froze, for the Hand of God skill icon had almost finished recharging. Now the recharge was complete, and Joe himself had said that was what made this trial worthwhile. The demon cat girl was in front of Joe in an instant, who had just gotten the opportunity to use the God Hand. With a fierce gaze, the girl swiftly struck at Joe, causing him to lose blood. But Joe smiled instead of giving up, mentally saying that now everything had worked out. The demon cat girl was behind Joe's back and started shouting at Joe, saying that this little thief would burn in hell. Joe immediately noticed her. The demon cat girl struck, but alas, Joe managed to block the demon cat's attack. The demon's face changed from anticipating victory to a sad face. The demon girl was surprised that her attack was blocked. She noticed the two-handed sword and that it was not just a piece of jewelry. The blood-covered Joe's gaze blurred and asked the demoness why she was so surprised. Joe himself realized that the distance was now enough. Joe activated the God Hand and tensed the atmosphere, visibly surprising his opponent, who was looking at Joe's right hand with her mouth open. Joe told Demoness that he had an even bigger surprise for him. Joe, destroying the pixels around, and stretched his hand forward with a cloudy look. And after the system window notified Joe that the theft was successful and the skill 10 steps. 1 critical strike was successfully stolen. The girl, losing her balance and looking at her hands, could not understand what had happened. For some reason, she felt that she could not make her critical strike. In the blink of an eye, Evil Joe was behind the girl's back and made her feel all the danger by reaching out his hand towards her head. Joe ordered the Gaze of Death skill to open, and this caused his eyes to start glowing fiercely red. The Death Gaze itself was activated and set up a target for Joe, namely the weak spot on the girl's neck. Turning around, the girl couldn't understand how the hell Joe had used her skill. Her eyes glazed over after she turned around and saw the cold eyes of Joe swinging his sword at her. The girl tried to jump back while Joe was preparing to attack her with his two-handed sword with a lot of dark energy emanating from it. And the system was showing a window that 4 nines of damage would be dealt right now, for the damage was 20 times more due to the critical strike. After a while, Joe stood in front of the defeated demon. The girl struggled to get up, rising on 2 hands and falling down again. The girl asked Joe, who the hell is he? After all, it was impossible for a thief to overcome so many restrictions at one time. Joe, without disabling the skill and continuing to stand in an epic pose, continued to make dark energy emanate from his sword. A system window appeared and notified Joe that the final boss was dead. Joe, with a smile, thought, mentally stating that she deserved to be the final boss. Because if you compare with the goblins, there is a significant difference in level, but in combination with these skills, damage was even more than he expected. The system window appeared next to the chest. The system also notified Joe that it congratulates him, a player named Death Star. He successfully passed the initial level, and in this regard, he received a reward, Forbidden Treasure Chest. This system window also appeared all over the Dawn world, which said the same thing. The people around him, looking at this window, couldn't believe that it was true. They thought he was amazing. Many of them couldn't even understand his profession. Others also asked him to teach them how to play like the Death Star. In a dark church, lights burned and laughter rang out, where inside a man with a mask that showed only one eye spoke the name Death Star with a smile. Raising his hands and creating fire, he addressed his hooded subordinates, stating that he surely had a powerful soul, and if sacrificed, the Lord would be resurrected. He ordered his subordinates to find him now. Also, events shift to the Blue Star Federation, a huge building that smells of wealth and cyberpunk. Sitting at the meeting table, the main man stated that the Death Star is such a powerful newcomer that he will definitely become a target of the people from the Church of the End. He orders to find the Death Star and protect him at any cost. Everyone present immediately agreed. At this time, Joe coughed, not realizing who was thinking the same thing about him. In any case, he was now sitting near the chest and was interested in it. He decided to ignore the little things and, laughing, decided to see what was in this chest that the system had given him. Afterward, a bright light appeared, and Joe's gaze froze. He reached out his hand towards the open box. Joe couldn't believe that he had obtained the so-called golden legend from this chest. There are different treasure chests in the world of this game. For example, there are ordinary wooden boxes, luxurious gold chests with red diamonds, and unusual shining diamond chests. Yeah, just like in Clash Royale. Joe, enveloping the forbidden treasure chest with dark energy, still realized that the best thing in this world was considered the forbidden treasure chest. The open chest showed that Joe received the Sword of Damocles. The system notified him that this is a throwing weapon, that after throwing it causes 400% physical damage and 300% lightning damage to all creatures within a radius of 30 meters from the target. The conditions for improving this sword is quite complicated. He needs to kill 10,000 monsters with this sword, and the effect will be as follows. Joe will additionally cause 30% of the true damage to the health of the enemy. With a wicked smile, Joe charged his sword with dark energy again, saying that with this sword, he looks like a walking atomic bomb. And hell yeah, he's right. The events are set in the real world, a huge skyscraper where the hooded man finds out where Joe lives. He lives in apartment 606 of building number 6, and that's the address the unknown man came to. The system window notifies Joe that he has visitors. Immediately, Joe leaves the game. With fear on his face, he simultaneously realizes that it is most likely his sister who must return. Still, for the first time, Joe opens the system window, realizing that first he needs to hide his nickname and see what kind of person came to him. Hiding the system window, Joe cautiously turns his gaze to the door, saying he'll be right there. When Joe opens the door, he asks what person is standing in front of him. It turns out not to be Jehovah's Witnesses, but only a man who tells Joe that he wants to tell him about their church. Beneath the hood lurked a strange man with pale skin, similar to that of a vampire. Clenching his fist and smiling, the man assured that their church believed in a great Lord of the End who was capable of bringing them to change this world. Just like that, the unknown man put his hand forward and showed his seal. Just like that, he started to assure Joe that he was the beginning of everything, and the awakening of Joe's own rare profession was the will of their master. So the man asked him to join them. Joe smiled awkwardly. Not taking his eyes off of the unknown man, he said he didn't need anything. He started to reach for the phone, completely unaware of which end and Lord he was talking about. He concluded that it was a cult that had somehow found them. In that case, Joe hid the phone behind his back and dialed the police, mentally saying that in that case, he'd better go to the authorities to deal with this. Joe similarly started to slowly close the door. Apparently, the unknown man had noticed this, so his face was burning with anger. The unknown man stopped the door that was about to close and started to open it again. Joe gritted his teeth under the weight of the weight and realized that this was no ordinary man, for his strength was extremely great. The unknown man was so angry that even his eyes turned red. The unknown man asked Joe if he was calling for a position, asking so that it sounded more like an affirmative than a question. The unknown man kicked the door and immediately invaded Joe's apartment, shouting, "Why the hell dare he call the police?" In that case, the unknown man's gaze changed for a second and he began to summon his sword. The unknown man made a scary face, saying that he would have to send the kid straight to his master. The unknown man started swinging his sword furiously, trying to kill the boy and shouting for him to die. Joe wasn't a slip of the tongue. He immediately used the God Hand skill. While thinking that whether it was weapons or skills, he still had to steal something from him to make him weaken. The system started creating red pixels and throwing out red boxes, asking Joe to pay attention to the fact that the Hand of God skill couldn't be used against players who were human. Joe, jumping back from the unknown man's subsequent attack with a frozen stare, couldn't understand where this ban came from. Turning around, Joe finds a knife lying on the table. He also assures that he originally thought his sister had returned, so now he is completely unarmed. Joe immediately grabbed the blade from the table, mentally saying that he had to finish this bastard off. Anyway, thanks to the Weapon Master skill, Joe could use absolutely any weapon. The look of death. Joe lights up with red energy, and Joe's eye lights up, detecting the weakness of the unknown who is about to strike. Joe uses the 10 steps, one critical strike skill he stole from the demon in the forest, causing his opponent to feel incredible damage. Alas, the unknown man turns around. Having received no damage, he smiles and declares that apparently he had particularly underestimated Joe. But since he had refused the church and called the police, his demise would follow. The unknown man appears behind Joe and prepares to attack. Joe realizes that he found something on his back. Joe dodges the blow at the last moment, so he is almost hit by the red energy. At the moment of the decisive blow, the unknown man is hit by a projectile, causing him to fall down without strength. At this time, two more unknown people burst into the apartment, whose silhouettes we see. It turns out to be Falcon Eye and, it turns out to be unknown two heroes. One armed with a bow, the other unknown stands with two pistols, and apparently they are allies. This loner loser, who is still not lacking in looks, lives in a world where the game is superior to all creatures, and at a certain point determines the profession of a player in the same game. His name is Joe, and he has become a thief, but not a simple one. He has received abilities unknown to anyone before that allow him to steal skills from his enemies. After all, he is now the target of many people. But let's go back to the continuation of the last part. 30 minutes later, the car drives off into the distance, and the savior archer explains to Joe that he was attacked by a cult. Or rather, it is a cult that emerges after the appearance of the so-called Dawn. They are known for killing professional players for fun, and if they set their eyes on a certain target, they won't let it go so easily. The savior explains to Joe that he is still weak, so if something like this happens again, he just has to contact the police again. In response, Joe thanks his rescuer, who was about to smoke because of his nerves. After the car left, Joe was called over by a girl who was dressed like a typical manhwa heroine. Running up to him and starting to breathe heavily, the girl asked little Joe, "And what's going on here?" She also wondered why there are policemen here. The hot girl put her hand on Joe's body, asking him what condition he was in, and if anyone had hurt him. Joe, sweating with embarrassment, made a frightened face, saying that everything was actually fine. The police were conducting a routine investigation. Joe abruptly turns around and starts walking back home. Joe tells his little sister that they need to go back home. The girl, falling because of Joe's sudden movement, says that she is very happy that everything is fine. After a while, Joe enters the code to open the door to the apartment. Joe opens the door and lets his sister in, His sister smilingly walks over and starts asking Joe how he feels today. His sister also asks him what profession he has awakened to, and also asks what Joe's nickname is because she wants to add him as a friend. Joe made a sad face and looked away, but his sister put her hand on his shoulder and looked at him with a smile, asking why Joe made such a sad face. His sister explains to him that everything is fine because even if his profession is just to live, his sister's salary is very big, so she will be able to provide for him now. Joe yawned in response and pushed his sister away with a sleepy face, saying that he doesn't need anything. He thanks his little sister but states that he is a little sleepy right now. Joe started to go up to the second floor, saying that he was going to go and rest. The poor little sister looks after him, thinking only of her little brother. Joe, rising, realizes that time has flown so fast that he himself has almost forgotten. 18 years ago, he was an abandoned orphan when he showed up here. One day it was raining near a store, and the worker of the store found a child lying in the rain. The worker actively asked passersby, "Whose child is this? Why was he left here?" Later, Joe was adopted by his little sister's family. The father told the little sister named Shinyu that he was little Yi, and from now on, he would live with them. Shinyu smilingly welcomed the little brother, hugging him and making him blush by saying that she was going to protect him no matter what. But alas, at one point, Joe's ancestors passed away unexpectedly. Joe tried to convince his little sister not to cry anymore, since she has him. Now, remembering the past events related to the man claiming Joe's weakness because he is a novice, Joe clenches his fist so tightly that the aura around him shudders. Joe realized that if he reveals his profession and nickname, his sister might be in danger. Joe clenches his fists even harder, mentally apologizing to his little sister, asking her to give him more time. Joe mentally declares that when he becomes strong enough, he will definitely tell her everything: his nickname, his profession, and his features. The events are brought back to the game, to the location of Manhwa village, where Joe is looking at his stats window, which shows that he still has the profession of thief, level 3, and the same 4 skills he stole earlier. Joe is only at level 3 now, so if he wants to level up quickly, he just needs to do the quest, for they can get him a lot of rewards and experience. Joe, standing in a deserted location in front of a cowboy-style bar, changes his look to a serious one, mentally saying that he remembers that the head of thieves is right in this bar. So Joe is going to learn a couple of skills from him and then look for a good quest. At this time, behind the bar sits a knight dressed in golden armor. By the way, reminds someone of a paladin, right guys? The man tells the young bartender that the Death Star is his buddy and he will definitely ask him to take care of him. The bartender is surprised that the knight is referring to the very player named Death Star, who easily passed the initial level. Joe, walking next to these guys, feels awkward, mentally saying that he didn't even realize he had such a cool buddy. At this time, open the door to the VIP room, where Joe's gaze will appear. Mentor, who is clearly a little tipsy, sits on a sofa from Cyberpunk and relaxes to the full, calling the girls near him useless. At this moment, Joe enters the room and greets his mentor and says that he would like to learn a skill. The drunk mentor gives him a system with 3 icons and tells him he can choose one of the 3 skills, thus starting to mix up the girls next to him. Yeah, such stupid drunk people. Joe began to think that poisoning and stab in the back is not really needed, but invisibility is a skill that will suit any thief. At this time, the mentor shouts at Joe because he thinks too long over the choice of skill. Joe tells his mentor that he is going to learn invisibility, and Joe asks if he has any assignments. A timer appears, and the mentor gets angry at Joe and points his finger at him, asking why he hasn't finished yet. The mentor sends him away, saying that his quests are not for the lowly, and the mentor points out that Joe has a very low level. Joe, already leaving the VIP room, hears a reminder from the mentor that he must pay 10 coins for the skill. Joe, looking at him, begins to remember that in this game is not quite a lot of normal NPCs. Joe, walking towards the exit, he hears a guy in gold armor addressing Joe. The man in gold armor advises him not to look for trouble if he has a low level. Also funny, the man says that only a Death Star could behave like that. The man is not as ugly as the mentor after all, so he advises Joe to go to the Wild Wolf Valley, practice, survive the night, and then he can level up right away the next day. At this time, the white-haired girl handing over a mug of beer is surprised by the sudden guest, saying that even a child would not take such a big sword and strap it on his back, being a thief. The mentor, taking the mug of beer, continues to listen to compliments in his direction. At that moment, a huge wolf flew in and destroyed the table in front of the mentor. Joe appeared, rattling the girls, who immediately tucked their tails at the sight of him. Joe has also raised his level to level 5. Joe apologizes to his mentor for the noise, saying that his hand just slipped. Joe also asks his mentor to give him a quest. The frightened mentor immediately puts on a friendly smile, advising him to go to the north of the village, for there he can take beginner's tasks. The mentor, looking at Joe, doesn't understand. Who the hell is this kid? A system window appears in front of Joe, and with a smile, Joe accepts the quest his mentor gave him. The events are transferred to the Gloomy Ridge, a location that is almost nothing but stone slabs on the floor. Joe went through the portal and coming out surprised that this place can somehow be considered a dungeon. Joe thought of the easy quest that his mentor mentioned. He was thinking of having a maid with pink hair and beautiful figures on the quest who would threaten him with a belt. What? Still, Joe enters the staircase with the intention that he, as a serious man, will not allow himself to be fooled. Joe opens the gate, and at the same moment he realizes that he starts falling down. The dark energy does not help him to start levitating, although it looks beautiful. Despite Joe trying to slow his fall with energy, he sinks deeper and deeper into the abyss that has opened. As Joe fell, it was realized by the mentor for quite some time had passed since the recent events. The mentor, sitting at the table and sipping his beer, realizes that Gloomy Ridge is the last and most difficult task of their Manhwa village. Smiling like an evil anime character, the mentor shouts that if some little bastard made him embarrass himself, then now he himself will suffer to the fullest. At this time, it appeared that Joe had fallen into the depths of the Gloomy Ridge, where the now empty slabs of stone had been replaced by an equally empty forest submerged in completely dry trees. Falling down, the covered Joe actually took quite a bit of damage, while the system also notified Joe that he had arrived at the dungeon. Behind Joe, sounds of dark energy and metal began to be heard. They were ghost knights, which according to the system window, have level 8 and 1000 health and 300 magic. Joe, looking around, also receives a system notification that he has arrived in a dungeon, and his task in this dungeon is to kill 100 ghost knights in 8 hours. Surrounded by ghostly knights, Joe, changing weapons using an interesting system that works with magic spheres, realizes that there are a lot of enemies, and his Hand of God skill has a cooldown. So even if he uses this skill with a skeleton sword that attacks single targets, it will be too slow. So he realizes that 8 hours is a very short time. Joe uses the spheres to summon his huge sword of Damocles, which we now see in full glory. A purest blade that is coated with dark energy as well as a hilt in an aristocratic shape. With a smile, Joe began to prepare his sword and charge it. After Joe abruptly launched his sword with shouts of, "Go!" The blade itself, of course, began to move forward and twist, being covered in a strong, dark purple-colored energy. A huge explosion appeared where the sword landed, emanating the same dark purple energy. This explosion made Joe smile and stand in a cool pose. The system notified Joe that 10 out of 100 knights had been killed, while Joe himself did not take his eyes off the explosion and continued to admire the great damage of his sword, mentally assigning it the status of a forbidden weapon, becoming more and more convinced with each passing second. After that, Joe called his sword back, and in a moment it was back in his hand, gaining new power and more energy. Joe knew that he had to finish quickly, so he smiled as he realized that he had an interesting idea. Joe abruptly launched his sword so that it spun and began to ricochet from one place to another and blast a small part near that area with the same explosion as last time. In an instant, Joe's sword traveled the distance that a NASCAR racer travels in 1 hour of riding, and then the sword returned directly into Joe's hands, leaving a trail of wind behind it. Joe closed his eyes against the backdrop of defeated knights and piles of smoke, concentrated and returned his sword back to his inventory, saying that it was too easy. Calling up the system window with his inventory, Joe was a little upset because in his inventory he had a strange rare scroll, a regular helmet, and a strangely shaped healing item. Joe didn't find anything useful here except for a couple of guaranteed skill books, and the rest was just junk, for there were no normal weapons. At this moment, energy began to gather behind Joe, and from that energy, a huge sword monster emerged, emitting a dark red energy. Apparently, the Ghost Knight's boss has a third eye and epic armor. After activating his abilities, the boss asked Joe if he was the one who had killed all his subjects. Finally, the boss appeared before us in full height, a huge red cloak, and I would say it was the Lich King in dark red shades from World of Warcraft. Activating his abilities, the boss said loudly that Joe was about to pay with his life. Joe, resisting the boss's strength with a smile, was surprised by the boss's behavior, and then with a smirk, mentally said that at least something interesting was starting to happen. Joe was using invisibility. The boss found that only dark purple energy was left in Joe's place, and the boss was surprised that Joe had disappeared in the blink of an eye. Joe appeared behind the boss, jumping from behind. He intends to activate the God Hand and steal something sweet from the boss. By the way, judging from the boss's face, he obviously felt it. The system notified Joe that the theft was successful. Joe swept across the battlefield, leaving a purple trail with the help of the God's Hand. Joe looked at his hand and the mask in it. Joe also wondered what was in his hand. The system window that appeared in front of Joe informed Joe that this is a mysterious mask that allows him to change his appearance and nickname. But losing it, he will return to his original appearance. The King of Knights was very angry. He began to tremble and, clutching his hand, called Joe a damn thief, also asking him how he dared to steal the mask right in front of his eyes. Dark red smoke began to emanate from behind the King of Knights, and the King of Knights fell to his knees, causing his sword to sink into the ground and emit more and more dark red energy. The King of Knights continued to scream in pain, and then the dark smoke completely engulfed the Night King, and the Night King himself loudly declared that he couldn't hold it back any longer. The King of Knights' equipment began to fly apart due to the energy explosion that appeared in his armor. Joe, running away from the stream of smoke, looked back and tried to figure out what it was. Joe still saw the system window notification that said that the warrior had revealed his true identity, so the system also advised him to complete a special mission: kill the Great Dark Knight. Now, in place of the cool dark skeleton, Joe saw a huge knight who, instead of a head-huge red crystal with a dark dot in the middle, and the king himself was surrounded by tentacles. The warrior told Joe that he will now take care of his punishment, namely, he will take off Joe's skin and use it as a mask. The warrior grabbed his blade and charged it with his energy, after the Dark Knight immediately took it out of the ground and launched a huge shadow slash at Joe with that sword. The slash was so strong that it was more like a wave that was destroying everything ahead like a tsunami of bloody color. Joe luckily managed to jump up and dodge this attack. Fortunately, Joe landed back on the ground. Joe was already thinking that everything had turned out well. But raising his head, Joe's gaze immediately changed. The King of Knights appeared in front of Joe and appeared right in front of him at the speed of light. The King of Knights shouted at Joe to die, but despite realizing how fast the King of Knights was, Joe managed to draw his sword and charge it with energy, thus saving himself from being hit. The King of Knights' blow was so strong that the two warriors were thrown back from each other after the swords clashed. Joe gritted his teeth, which is understandable because now he had a throwing weapon in his hands, and it is not suitable for close combat. Joe, trying to hold the power of his blade, realized that he could no longer resist. At this moment, the King of Knights began to concentrate energy in his tentacles and spread them apart with the principle of a whirlpool. Joe tried to get closer, sticking to the principles of parrying the tentacle's attack. Unfortunately for Joe, he was still hit by the tentacle and was crushed. Joe, who had received a lot of damage, still decided to try his luck again with his God Hand skill. Joe, barely able to stay on his knees, turned to the King of Knights and said that he couldn't believe that a freak like him could be so strong. Afterwards, Joe shouted loudly enough and called the poor Night King a nasty, nasty bunch of tentacles. The King of Knights could no longer tolerate the kid's taunts, so he attacked Joe, raising his sword as high as possible and preparing to strike Joe, calling him a sneaky thief who was tired of living. The system notified Joe that the recharge of his skill had been completed, so Joe's gaze changed and his hand began to burn with a purple light. In the blink of an eye, Joe stole his sword from the King of Knights, leaving the King of Knights puzzled and confused as to where his sword, Dionysus, had gone. Joe was glad that he had such a wonderful sword in his arsenal. Now Joe could fight with two swords at once, and with one sword that was so supercharged. The system had given the sword of Dionysus a perfect class, which was simply unbelievable. Joe activated his Stare of Death 10 steps skill, and the color of his eyes changed. Joe swept across the battlefield with his new toy in an instant, leaving behind a scarlet trail of energy. The Demon King opened his eye wide, which reminds me of a crystal. The monster began to taunt Joe, telling him that he was incapable of anything. For even taking away his weapons, he could not even strip him of his armor. In response, Joe asked the King of Knights without changing his face, "Really?" In the next second, the Night King's entire armor was destroyed as he took 19478 damage. Joe, still running across the battlefield and preparing for the next attack, loudly said that with his weapon and damage bonuses that allowed him to see through vulnerabilities and kill in 10 steps, nothing was impossible. In that case, the system alerted Joe that the boss had started to go into a rage, going into another phase. A body made up of tentacles and multiple eyes began to scream violently in pain. Finally, the boss's body revealed its true form, and the King of Knights himself declared that the foolish worm Joe would pay for such an acquisition very heavily. Joe grinningly pointed his finger at the boss and clarified, "Pay? For what? For watching such a lowly wretch?" At this moment, the boss's eyes almost started to pop out. Apparently, the King of Knights had forgotten about the fact that Joe had 2 imbue blades instead of 1. Joe ordered the monster to disappear from the face of the earth, and the system notified Joe that the Sword of Damocles had been successfully activated. The sword itself jumped, leaving a trail of violet energy behind it. It headed straight for the King of Knights, and then a huge explosion was created that literally wiped out half of the area. The system window that appeared congratulated Joe on killing the world boss, so it also notified him that a system announcement would be created, so it decided to ask the player whether to publish it anonymously or not. Joe, pressing the yes button with a smile, decided to be a little more modest, and therefore send the notice to everyone anonymously. In this regard, a system notification was created in front of the eyes of many players, which congratulated the mysterious player from the newcomer village for killing the Great Dark Knight, a world-class boss, and also the system notified everyone that he had received a golden treasure chest. When he opened the chest, Joe's eyes froze as he received a scroll with a task that offered him to start a hidden quest called Undelivered Letter. He was offered to go directly to Xiaoyu in Sleepless Village, but the reward for such a quest was unknown. Joe, on the other hand, was very happy about this acquisition. At the current time the timer is about to expire, the thieves' mentor looks at the timer with a wry smile and a bottle of beer in his hand, discovering that 2 hours have passed. The mentor realizes that the guy has probably given up by now. At this time, Joe bursts into the bar so loudly that it shocked all the customers. Well, of course, the mentor also takes notice without slowing down. Joe's appearance made the mentor stare at Joe with his mouth open. It was not surprising since Joe was able to return from the most dangerous dungeon in their village. Joe, filling the surrounding atmosphere with his awesomeness, looks at the poor mentor, disdainfully holds out a bag of coins to him, saying that there are 500 gold coins for learning a skill in there. Joe declares that he would like to inquire about a place. Taking the sack, the thieves' mentor panikedly begins to untie it, telling Joe to confidently ask him anything his soul desires. Then Joe takes out the very scroll that loot from the dungeon. Holding it out to the mentor, he asks him, "Does the mentor know where the Sleepless Village mentioned here is?" Hearing these words, the mentor squeezed the sheet, and then despite Joe's averted gaze to the side, the mentor began to violently drink the bottle of beer. Loudly placing the bottle back on the table, the mentor still didn't change the look he got from what he had heard earlier. The mentor asked Joe if he knew what kind of people didn't sleep, and then the mentor answered his own question by saying that dead people don't sleep. The sleepless village is now called the Village of the Dead. Joe froze at what he heard. The Village of the Dead is only 30 miles west of the Novice Village. There is a tunnel leading there, and the dungeon of the Village of the Dead appears every day at midnight. The lowest level of monsters there is level 25, with the highest level of players in the newcomer village being only level 20. Anyway, it's a ruined place engulfed in ashes and red flames. In this village also has a boss, a skeleton dressed in silver armor. He himself has a flame instead of a chest, and his level is 30th, and his amount of health will impress any MMO player. 100,000 units of health cannot be found in the monster. Mentor continued to tell Joe all the information that he knew without changing his face. He also told Joe about the rumors of finding in this village of the item that will allow any player to change his profession. But despite all this, place is too dangerous, so the mentor advises him. At this point, Joe stopped listening to the poor mentor. His thoughts were immediately occupied with the item that will allow him to change his profession. Joe didn't finish listening to the mentor, and so began to walk off into the distance with a smile, thanks to the mentor who realized that Joe hadn't heard a single word he said. Joe smilingly began to adjust his gloves, and at one point he realized that he had to prepare a lot, for there would be level 25 monsters. First of all, he decided to get rid of the trash he was currently wearing. Joe, approaching the system window in a Preverie cyberpunk setting, he mentally explained to us that the game Dawn merges with real life, so that all items from the game world can be sold and similarly exchanged in real life. The Chamber of Commerce, however, which is in a country in the top 3 called Black Dragon, claims that they can interact with the Dawn at will. Joe himself now enters the city. He finds his sister there, who is wearing a white dress that is big, and also apparently his sister's girlfriend, who Joe, for some unknown reason, calls her a bloody witch. Sis immediately saw her brother, so she pointed her finger at him and asked Joe why he was here. Joe's sister also saw the appearance of her brother and asked what he was wearing. She realized that because of his appearance, he was probably a killer by profession. Joe, with an awkward expression, started to say that he was a murderer. Luckily, Joe was able to use a mask to hide his true identity before coming here. Otherwise, Jiang Xiaoyu, the witch, would have exposed him. The witch began to poke fun at Joe, asking why it was their two-handed swordmaster who switched to a dagger. The witch trying to piss Joe off in every possible way. Joe told the witch that he would be stronger than her, even with a dagger behind his back. This behavior did not please Joe's sister, and she loudly began to shout that if the two of them met, they would immediately become sarcastic and misbehave. Of course, these words made Joe and the witch turn away from each other and snort unhappily. Sis smilingly rejoiced that Joe had arrived on time, because now she could buy something to help Joe get through his rookie period. Joe, of course, was not happy about this. The witch realized that Joe was up to something, so she appeared in a moment in front of his gaze and warned Joe that if he just tried to spoil her mood, he would immediately die on the spot. Joe realized that he was risking his life with a cloudy look, told his sister that he did not need to buy something too expensive. Due to sister's suggestion, Joe and his girlfriends came to the equipment store. Sister, of course, with a smile, started looking around everything while asking the girl consultant to bring here the best assassin gear for beginners. In response, the counselor opened the door. The counselor smilingly showed Joe with her hand that he should go further, to the closet. Yeah, buddy, you're gonna waste a lot of time now. Of course, while searching for outfit, there were many options that had a level as good as perfect, and which, judging from the looks of it, were offered to his sister by the Wicked Witch. In the end, after spending 2 hours, Joe was able to dress in a blood dragon cloak, a dark t-shirt, dark night pants, and hermit boots. Joe is very tired in the company of girls, but alas, the female power is too strong, and so they consume poor Joe mentally more and more. The witch notices that Sister Xinyu has good taste, and the sister notices that Joe looks cool in this outfit. Afterwards, the sister decided to ask the seller about the price of this outfit. The saleswoman opened the system window and stated that the girl should provide 1,889,999 gold coins as payment. Of course, the little sister started to do so immediately. The witch prodded Joe, pointing out the fact that his sister was taking care of him again. Joe looked at his watch and then realized that he had let himself be dressed in new clothes after all. Joe decided it was time to get out of here. Joe said goodbye to his sister and the witch. Joe advised her to walk here for now, go shopping, and spend time in the city. Joe himself explained that he needed to go to the game world to fulfill a mission. The sister did not object. She waved her hand at Joe and asked him not to delay. The events moved to the location, entrance to the sleepless village. Joe appeared looking at some object with his mouth open. Looking forward, he only saw a completely empty village covered in fog, with old Japanese houses with lights on. The system assigned 3 stars of danger to this dungeon and also indicated that the level of the dungeon was from 25 to 30. Joe took a step forward, passing through the barrier that enveloped the village. Joe looked around the village and didn't understand what level 25 monsters he was talking about, because so far he only saw children playing their fun games. While playing, the child fell face down. Joe immediately paid attention to him. Joe went over to the child and tried to help him, asking if he was okay. The child stated that there was nothing wrong. The child raised his head. It turned out to be the son of the Lich King from WoW. Just kidding. It's just a skeleton kid who thanked Uncle Joe for his help. Joe turned around and saw many knights slaughtering children and burning houses. In short, he saw chaos. Joe froze in fear. The emotion of losing a loved one. It made Joe grit his teeth and was terrified of what was happening. Joe began to tense the atmosphere around him, realizing that this was the thing he didn't want to remember the most. Joe received a system window that explained that he had a new mission: kill the Ghost Knight. Joe took out his dark blade that he stole from the last boss. Equipping it, he was covered in dark red energy. Joe began to prepare for the attack and address the scum who were killing the villagers. Finally, Joe put his sword forward and declared that the attackers were not worthy of the rank of knights. The knights immediately turned their heads towards Joe and began to show aggression towards him. Green energy began to flow from the knights and started pouring into the eyes of the skeletons. These are level 25 ghost knights that have already started attacking Joe. Joe didn't intend to tolerate the noise of the stupid skeletons, so he used the invisibility skill he had learned earlier from the thief mentor. Only a silhouette of red energy remained in Joe's place, and Joe himself turned to the knights during the cessation, saying that they were assholes unworthy of him wasting valuable skill on them. Joe began to spin around like a Lego Ninjago character and dodge the skeleton's blows. Joe also managed to counterattack the skeleton beautifully, cutting everything with hollow dark energy. The other skeletons were surprised by Joe's lunge, which cut off the skeleton's head in an instant. After Joe was attacked by another squad of skeletons, Joe started charging his blade even harder, and in the blink of an eye, it swept across the battlefield and slashed many of these skeletons, bouncing from one skeleton to another and dealing 6,000 damage. After silencing the skeletons, Joe began to put his sword in his inventory. Joe said that he was sorry for killing them, for death for such assholes was only a small punishment for them. The system window explained to Joe that the Ghost Knight had been killed, and it turns out that the current experience level had reached the upper limit of 20 units, and now the extra experience would be automatically sealed. The system window also notified Joe that after finishing the second mission, the experience would automatically be printed out. The earth abruptly began to shake, and Joe also received a second notification from the system, which ordered Joe to kill the undead lord who started to appear right away. A green aura began to emanate from the ground, and then a hand sharply stuck out of the ground, and then the body of the undead lord appeared. It turned out to be a huge skeleton with a green crystal in armor. The undead lord also had a level 30 and 4 skills that, judging by the sound, were very strong. The lord with a smile began to rush towards Joe, shouting that he was immortal and omnipotent in this wretched world. Alas, Lord was too stupid. Looking at Joe, who was charging the energy for his next lunge, he realized something. Joe's lunge was so precise that he managed to hit the flames in his chest. Joe also used the death stare skill, the 10 steps to kill. Joe, covering himself with purple energy in a pathos face, said that the dead should stay away from the world of the living. In a second, the skeleton's body was shattered by Joe's strongest blow, so much so that all the bones on the Lord's body were scattered into particles. Joe received notification that he had received 2 new items. Joe found this to be a fortunate event, for one of the items he received had unique abilities. Joe received a perfect level accessory called Undead Bracelet, which allowed him to summon a revenant skeleton to fight Joe. Joe also received the system suggestion to learn the Ghost Step, which once used, increases the item's speed by 30%, which lasts for 5 seconds and increases evasion by 60%. Joe, of course, agreed to learn this skill, and so a huge stream of energy was channeled into Joe's body. Joe smilingly accepted this energy, stating that he was very lucky. Joe finds dodging an extremely useful skill that increases his chance of dodging by 60%, which practically makes him invulnerable for 5 seconds. The system window notified Joe that he had received an Undead Lord's helmet as proof that he had killed an Undead Lord. Joe placed the item in his hand, and at the same instant it began to spin. Joe, looking at this item, said that it was probably the beginning for the next mission. Namely, it was likely that this item would be very important in the next mission. Afterward, Joe went in search of Xiaoyu. The events moved to a sleepless village, a cemetery of villagers. Joe meets a little girl crying over one of the graves. Joe approaches the girl and sits down beside her, but the girl continues to cry despite Joe's attempts to calm her down. The girl in tears tells Joe that those bad knights killed everyone in the village, and Mom and Dad, judging by her words, fell in a sad battle. Joe asks the girl if her name is Xiaoyu, and the girl turns to Joe with a sad face and says it is her. Joe got up on his feet and gave the girl a good scare. Joe apologized to Xiaoyu for disturbing her, but was interrupted by the girl. She saw the weapons of the bad knights that made her mom and dad get killed. Tears immediately appeared in the girl's eyes, and she herself pushed Joe away and ran further away. Joe shouted in the wake of the girl, who was drowning in tears, that he was not a bad person. Alas, the system notified Joe that Xiaoyu, an unknown object to the system, was angry, and her positive opinion parameter about Joe was 0. The girl began to envelop the battlefield with green energy. Raising her hands, she began to say that bad knights always lie. The girl started to ask for help from the uncles, for the bad guys were here again to hurt Xiaoyu. A moment later, a horde of monsters began to appear, which Joe looked back and noticed immediately. Xiaoyu pointed her finger at Joe and shouted that this time she was not going to let the bad knights harm them again. She ordered the uncles to get rid of that rascal. Joe stood in a fighting stance, began to think about what to do. He thought about killing the child, but Joe remembered the golden words of the mentor that the focus there is not on killing monsters. Joe decided to believe the mentor, and so he stopped his hand and with a nonchalant face relaxed his body, let the uncles start their super attack. Joe heard a beautiful female voice saying that the traveler had finally proved his virtue. Joe opened his eyes. The light that appeared in front of him was so bright that he had to cover himself a little. He saw the beautiful feet of the goddess. The girl appealed to the undead souls, asking them to rest back. A light breeze allowed the girl to land very elegantly, but alas, as elegantly, the author could not draw the eyes. Joe saw this goddess blushed and opened his eyes wide, wondering who she was. Little Xiaoyu rushed to the goddess, calling her Qingyu's sister. She cried on the pillows. Xiaoyu was overjoyed at Qingyu's arrival. Qingyu smilingly told Xiaoyu that it was okay. As long as she was here, no one could harm her ever. Joe only reached out his hand to the two, and then continuing to admire the beautiful, he realized that this girl looked cold, but to the children she was contentedly gentle. The atmosphere made Joe silent. He turned away and blushed even more, saying that it reminded him of something. Goddess Qingyu sat down and smiled. Resting her heels on the am, she placed her hands on the girl's face. Joe noticed the similarities between the two girls, saying that their names were not only similar, but their looks were as similar as their names. Little Xiaoyu pointed her finger at Zhou, asking her sister to chase away that bad boy. Qingyu, on the other hand, tried to explain to Xiaoyu with a smile that there was some misunderstanding. She patted her little sister on the head and then turned to Zhou. The little sister hoped that Zhou would forgive the little girl, for this child was an orphan and she was very wary of strangers. Zhou received a notification from the system that Zhou should ask her about Xiaoyu's life experience, and maybe he could open side quests related to this goddess. By the way, it's not a goddess. I just call her that because she's outwardly beautiful. Qingyu plunged into her thoughts, picturing a field of wheat. Qingyu herself began to explain that this happened 10 years ago. Sleepless Village was then called the village that never cares. While Xiaoyu was grabbing butterflies, she noticed that the residents were hardworking and always had enough to do. Even though Xiaoyu's family was poor, they were happy. Until one moment. Xiaoyu's mom and dad found the defeated people in armor in the forest. Of course, Xiaoyu, as a proper girl, immediately called her parents and tried to convince them that they should help these people. Zhou, picking up the helmet of one of the monsters, tried to ask Qingyu if she was talking about the monsters he had killed. Qingyu and Xiaoyu clenched their fists, and Qingyu began to loudly declare that all those knights had indeed slaughtered the entire village after recovering from their wounds. Qingyu explained that those lowlifes were no different from bandits. Tears flowed from Xiaoyu's eyes, and Xiaoyu began to explain that it was all her fault, because if she hadn't gone to save them, no one would have died, and then Xiaoyu's mom and dad wouldn't have had to die. Qingyu turned to Zhou, pointing out that the carefree village had eventually become a land of the dead after the massacre, and all the souls that had died here were trapped by Xiaoyu's regret and obsession with reliving the horrors that had happened here over and over again. Now Zhou also realized that Xiaoyu was not an impudent girl. The system notified the surrounding people that Xiaoyu couldn't hold back her tears. Xiaoyu began to be covered in scarlet dark energy, and Qingyu notified Zhou that Xiaoyu was losing control. A tornado of the same energy as before began to appear around Xiaoyu, and Qingyu ordered Zhou to run away from here quickly, for once caught in the storm, Zhou would also become undead and trapped in this village. The system window notified Zhou that Xiaoyu was so sad that a storm of tears was about to break out in the dreamless village. The system gave Zhou the choice of running away or helping her, and the system also stated that the probabilities of success was 1%. Zhou resisted the enormous flow of energy and wondered what was happening, while the girl's tears continued to flow as the situation grew more and more intense. Qingyu tried to reach out to Xiaoyu, but alas, the energy flow was too strong. At one moment, Zhou grabs Qingyu's hand and then turns her gaze to himself, telling Qingyu that it's time for them to leave. But Qingyu refuses, explaining that she can't let this child become undead. Qingyu convinces Zhou that she must save her. Then Zhou pushes Qingyu away and says that he will save her if she does. Qingyu couldn't believe what was happening. Watching Zhou trying to get closer to her sister, she couldn't believe that Zhou would do this for Xiaoyu. Zhou realized that things were very bad. Zhou managed to get very close to Xiaoyu. Zhou continued to reach out to the girl, and after successfully approaching her, he turned to Xiaoyu explaining that he had actually come here to deliver a message. Zhou held out a letter to the girl. This made the girl stop crying. Zhou explained that it was a letter he got from the Dark Knight after he killed him. Zhou explains that maybe this is something she should find out immediately. Of course, Xiaoyu read everything. Xiaoyu herself realized that it was all planned originally to destroy her village. The wounded Zhou put his hand on Xiaoyu's shoulder, with a sad face saying that even if she didn't save those people, they would still come. Zhou stated that it was not Xiaoyu's mistake. Xiaoyu, with a smile on her face, started to disappear, thanking Traveler Zhou. Xiaoyu's body vaporized, and she thanked her saviors, saying that she could finally leave this world with peace of mind. This situation made tears appear in Qingyu's eyes. Looking at her wounded savior, she thanked Zhou. Sunset, or sunrise, it didn't matter. Looking at the beautiful picture of the city, Qingyu resigned herself, saying that this village should be left as it was. Qingyu finally appeared before us in full pose, wearing the same beautiful black robe, mask on her face and dark hair, green eyes just like Alaska, Ahem. Yes, Qingyu folded her lips into a tube and held out a strange object to Joe which glowed purple and asked him to accept it as a token of gratitude. The system explained to Joe that he received some kind of medal of death. After using it, you can awaken a special profession, Reaper, and the mandatory professions he needs are Thief, Necromancer. Joe also requires level 20 to activate it. Joe, still looking at the medal, asked Qingyu if it was too big a reward. Then the priestess offered to take back the item, which did not please Joe. Joe immediately stretched his hand forward and said that he could not refuse such a gift. After Joe took the locket, the girl saw the ring on Joe's finger, which made her face change. Qingyu couldn't believe that Joe was really this person. Qingyu said goodbye to Joe in a flash, but Joe smiled at her and, clutching the medallion in his hand, turned to her, pointing out that she had given him a token of love. So could it be fate? This made Qingyu blush, and then Qingyu herself silently began to hope that they would see each other later. The events moved to the city, where in his cozy apartment, Joe is looking at his locket, remembering the beautiful Qingyu. At one moment, his thoughts are interrupted by his stepsister. Joe's sister walks up behind him and addresses Joe, pointing out the fact that he has been staring at the change medallion all morning. Look how the apron goes to beautiful little sister Joe. Sis addresses Joe by leaning on the back of a chair. Sis assumes that Joe gave him this sign as a token of love. This makes Joe blush. Joe immediately asks Sis to stop the sudden attacks in his direction. The stepsister moves closer and hugs Joe, pointing out that he's strangely agitated somehow. The sister now already thinking she's guessed. Then the relative, please note, half-sister starts rubbing him into pillows, saying that her penniless little brother has finally grown up and started thinking about love. Poor Joe was almost suffocated by the huge pillows. Finally, the sister decided to stop the death penalty and leave Joe alone, telling him to use the medal to change his profession and then go down for breakfast. Afterward, the sister closed the door, checking the click once more. This made the sister think about it. The sister suddenly remembered that he had already recently awakened his profession. The sister realized that he could already change his profession, which was strange enough. But after the siblings started to dance and go downstairs, not believing it, because little brother will always need his little half-sister's protection. The system window clarified to Joe whether he really wanted to change his profession. Joe was immersed in a huge orb of energy, which consequently enveloped the entire room. Joe shouted affirmatively that he wanted to change professions. Joe abruptly opened his eyes and the system window congratulated the Death Star player for successfully changing his profession to Reaper. Joe now stood in a fighting stance, energizing himself and marveling at the statistics in the system windows. Joe swung sharply, and after striking, he just kicked the hell out of the wall of his apartment. This was immediately noticed by his sister, who had apparently gone to work. The sister immediately started pointing her finger at Joe, saying that it would cost a lot. She started calling him an idiot. She also promised him a breakfast strike if he didn't clean up before she got here. Joe, through a hole in the wall, started asking his sister where she was going, to which she gave the perfectly reasonable answer that she was going to work. I hope she's not working as a role-playing queen. Joe checked the attribute window and was disappointed to find that his wisdom score was very low. He also realized that it was affecting him greatly. In general, here is the most boring. So in a nutshell, he opened the Reaper's gift skill that increases his damage from attacks by 10%, as well as Joe decided to reach level 35 and then open this and another skill of the profession of Reaper, and then show everyone around the true power of this profession. Afterwards, Joe pulled out his sword and went out to meet new adventures. As he went outside, taking out the trash, he met a woman in a latex suit who was going to kill him by seducing him? What? It could work, but whether it does, we'll find out tomorrow. Have a good day, guys. Joe was heading to the trash cans with 2 bags of huge monster. Joe threw all the bags into the trash cans, and then he was called by a girl calling the guy handsome. Joe turned around and saw a girl in a leather jacket and leggings. The girl was on the stairs and asked Joe, "Is that Joe Yi?" The girl introduced herself as the recruitment manager of the Scorpion Guild. And get this, the girl's name is Jo Yaya. Yaya also says that she heard that Joe has awakened the profession of assassin. Anyway, Yaya smilingly invites Joe to join them. Yaya walked closer to Joe and pulled out a packet of documents with a smile. Yaya assured Joe that they accept even newcomers. She explained that the guild mentors would quickly help Joe reach the 4th level, but the only inconvenience was that 10% of Joe's income would go to the guild. After the girl opening her doll mouth continued to talk about guarantees and other uninteresting things to no one, Yaya cautiously opened her hills. Afterward, the girl suggested finding another place where they could delve deeper and deeper into the topic. Joe responded by becoming a Sigma with a halo over his head and shielding himself with his arms. Joe said he wasn't interested. Joe said goodbye to the girl. Yaya started to panic. This could be understood by her trembling doll eyes and cold because Yaya could not understand, and therefore she wondered. My charisma did not affect him. Joe started to walk away, and the girl shouted at Joe, "Don't you even think about it?" Yaya put her hand behind her back and began to concentrate a stream of dark energy, and because of that, her hand began to be covered with darkness and a kind of spoil. Yaya began to say that because of Joe's refusal, she would not fulfill her monthly quota and she could be punished for it. The girl continued to make an angry face, her doll-like eyes becoming snake-like. The girl said indignantly that it wasn't the dawn, but a blue star. She didn't want any trouble, so first Yaya decided to persuade him to a deserted place. Joe finally turned around and apologized to Yaya, saying that if she had started the conversation elsewhere, he would have thought twice. Joe closed his eyes and then mentally recited the greatest quote. Remember, if a girl talks to you while you're throwing out the trash, she's either displeased or heartless. Joe continued to stand motionless while the warm light of the sun enveloped them. Joe assured Yaya that he was following the advice of his favorite little sister. Joe also said that he had already promised his sister to join the guild, where she was currently working as the vice head. Then cunning Yaya asked Joe whether he was not afraid that his entry will pull his sister to the bottom, because she is not yet the head of the guild. Joe firmly stated, "I'm not afraid." Joe started waving his hand and said that the guild leader was his sister's girlfriend. What? Yaya's hand continued to be covered in a semblance of spoilage. The cunning Yaya began licking her lips and smiling evilly, the cobra's eyes saying, "Interesting kid, so be it. Live for now. Once this matter is resolved, I'll come have fun with you again." Boom! A huge purple explosion appears in the Emerald Forest. The events are transported to the area of level 30 wild monsters. A purple stream of charged energy sweeps across the battlefield and shreds the wolf-like monsters. Not far from the thick of things, one of the hunters is about to attack a turtle. The turtle abruptly lights up with the same violet energy and is covered in a sphere-like shape with a lot of lightning coming from it. The turtle was defeated. Now it is lying unconscious, and the guy looks around and shouts, "What the? Someone stole my booty!" A huge pillar of smoke passes over the battlefield. A lot of hunters approach the toughest of them all. This hunter put down a bunch of monsters and gets 10 experience points every second. All the hunters are surprised that all those monsters in the back were put down by this guy. The hunters keep wondering who he is. The battlefield was once again filled with a rapid stream of purple energy that emitted lightning. Joe fixed his sword in his hands. Yes, it was a sword. Joe continues to stand with a pompous face. A standard system window appears in front of Joe's face, where he regretfully finds that his level is 22. Joe can't understand how come he spent 3 hours grind monsters, but in the end, he only got 1 level. Joe remembers how many monsters he has killed. Joe also realizes that at this rate, it will take at least 2 days to unlock new skills at level 25. Joe says this loudly and then declares that it is too slow. The other hunters start laughing and pointing their fingers at Joe, who is standing in front of many wolf corpses that are covered in purple energy. The foolish hunters mock Joe, saying that this idiot is talking nonsense. The hunters also can't believe that Joe wants to go from level 22 to level 25 in 3 days. Joe continued to stand pathetically and become the object of ridicule by the other hunters just as pathetically. The hunters continued to call Joe a juvenile upstart. for they had been in the area for almost a year and had only reached level 26. The hunters loudly tell Joe to stop stargazing, for they have been in this area for almost a year and have only reached level 26. The hunters continue to express disbelief at Joe one by one. In response, Joe closes his eyes and folds his arms coolly, saying that this place is a public area and everyone can kill monsters according to their abilities. In response, one of the hunters clenches his fist fiercely and turns to Joe, saying that everything he says is nonsense. Only those with the most are farming. The hunter also says that the monsters in this area belong to their morning wind guild. Each of the hunters immediately turn negative against Joe, many pulling out their weapons and getting into a fighting stance. The hunters ask Joe to stop talking nonsense. They decided to deal with the upstart in their favorite way. One of the hunters kept pointing his bow. The hunter makes his shot. A blue lightning arrow is about to fly at Joe. It felt as if Joe had slowed down time. Joe grabs the arrow with his hand and smashes it, saying, "Well, let's play." Many hunters attacked Joe and bared their axes and swords. Joe, on the other hand, started to pull out his huge sword and change in his gaze. Joe abruptly uses his sword and creates a lightning stream of energy with a light swing of his sword. All the hunters from such a movement flies away a couple of meters, completely covered in blood. One of the hunters watches Joe chopping down his allies, so he smiled and called Joe an asshole. The hunter attacks Joe from behind, but Joe continues to stand and cover his blade with lightning energy. For some reason, the hunter starts applying his intelligence and yells, "Die," while attacking from behind. Genius, no other way. Joe turns to the hunter. A red stream of lightning energy comes out of his eyes. His crystal that is in his sword starts to charge with energy. In an instant, a kind of energy circle appears, which blocks the attack of the stupid hunter, and then causes him to start squirming from the lightning strike. The hunter who tried to attack from behind falls to his knees. He starts crying to Joe and says that they were wrong. The hunter asks Joe not to hit him. It's better to urinate right on top of them. Joe put his sword back behind his back as he listened to each of the hunters beg him for mercy. The hunters also said that they were blind in their ignorance. The hunters promised to never make the same mistake again. The hunters kept asking Joe not to be angry. They assured Joe that this was only his territory now. Joe turned to one of the hunters and said with a coolness that there is nothing wrong with being afraid. Joe asked the hunter to tell him if there is any other way to gain experience and level up quickly besides playing in the jungle. The bald hunter raised his head to Joe and said that there are rumors that there is a secret place deep in the Emerald Forest. The bald man goes on to say that they came here to search the area on orders from the boss. Joe started to leave and said that they better not get in his face again, while Joe called the hunters lowlifes. Baldy thanked the departing Joe. One of the hunters turned to the bald man and called him K.E. Dong, saying that if the head found out that he had leaked the information about the secret place, then he would kill everyone. Then the bald man raised his head and said with a smile that his allies should be quiet and listen to him here. The bald man said that the mantis was catching a cicada, and he was already being accosted by a siskin, and that siskin would be their team. Baldy mentally called Joe a bastard, saying that whether Joe could find this secret realm or not, they would be able to use the power of the local boss to kill him. Baldy also remembered how Joe had called him a lowlife, so he promised that he would take revenge for such phrases. Now the night stars were beginning to go out again. Events were moving into the poisonous swamps deep within the Emerald Forest. Joe came to the same place he had been before and wondered why I was here again. Joe began to draw his sword and wondered, is there really a secret in this creepy place? Another system window appeared in front of Joe again, which congratulated the player for starting the secret mission, Hidden Werewolf Land. Another system window appeared which welcomed Joe to the land of werewolves. The level of this world is from 30 to 40. The number of creatures is from 1 to 25. The danger level is 4 stars. Joe kept looking into the portal that opened after the notification. Joe was very happy and said that these monsters were like what he had ordered. Joe rushed into the portal and said he couldn't find a better place to train. The system notified Joe that there were 15 minutes and 30 seconds left. Joe went through the huge purple portal. A system window appeared and congratulated the player on completing the first stage of the Hidden Land to Werewolves quest. The system window also notified Joe that the rewards had been placed in the backpack. Joe made a dissatisfied face and said, it's too easy again in the end." Joe opened the system window and began to lament about the fact that he had gotten another drop in the form of small things. Joe's gaze changed dramatically when he saw that he had gotten a cool level 30 necklace, a level 40 jinong. By the way, a two-handed sword again. Joe also obtained a teleportation bead to the secret realm. This item is restricted to the werewolf country. Joe also received another two-handed sword. Joe smiled at what he had gotten, saying that it was not such a bad loot. Now Joe felt that his backpack was about to come apart at the seams. Joe stabbed his sword into the ground and then sat down a bit, saying that first he had to examine all the drop, make room for it, and throw out any trash. Joe folded his hands and began to ponder while looking at the system window. Joe realized that the Sword of Damocles and the skeleton sword would be enough for him. Joe began to transfer Jing Hong into the melting window, saying that this weapon had average characteristics. Joe realized that it could be directly melted down as materials. Joe also carried the wolfskin shirt to the selling window. Joe began to be covered in blue pixels. He began to receive notifications of gaining a new level. The system window notified Joe that he had reached level 31. Joe himself was surprised to say that he had unlocked a level 25 skill. This time, he had earned a lot of money. Death Raven skill. Appeared system window notified Joe that he unlocked a new skill called Raven of Death. The fact that Joe, when using this skill, turns into a blood raven and then soars into the sky. He can also throw 72 feathers in a selected area from a great height. The target affected by the feather will be immobilized for 10 seconds. This effect cannot be dodged or dispelled. Joe swiped the system window with surprise, saying that this skill was quite interesting. Joe was already starting to ponder. Where could he use it? This question decided not to hang in Joe's mind for long. Behind Joe was heard the voice of the bald man, who was glad that they finally found him. The bald rat points his finger at Joe and addresses the boss, saying that this freak stole all the information from them about this place. Their boss is the same bald man and is nicknamed the Killer Hornet, Sha Jung-feng. Hornet is also the head of the Morning Wind Guild, with a black tattoo on his head and black gloves that match the acid green color. The guild boss turned to the kid and said that it was not too late for him to give up and leave. Then the bald man also began to tell the boss that he seemed to have already stolen the loot that used to belong to them. Then Joe turned to the bald man with a smile, saying that he had sung differently in the past when he traded the data of this place for his own life. This made the boss's face change. Baldy started to justify himself to the guild leader, saying that Joe was lying. The head of the guild began to turn around and say, "I don't get it." The guild leader grabbed the head of poor Baldy, who immediately started to snot. The guild leader started to squeeze Baldy's head. The guild leader strained his face so that his veins were visible. The guild leader was surprised that he had only just noticed that they had the same hairstyle. The head of the guild sucked all the energy out of the poor ward, saying that the guy was a pathetic parody of him. The head was surprised that his guild really had such jerks. He smiled and turned to Joe, ordering him to give them the teleportation bead nicely, and then promised to spare him. Joe looked at the guild leader and marveled at the fact that he was only level 40, but he was already a boss. Despite the tense situation, Joe continued to sit on the rock and mentally said that it was time to try out his new skill. In an instant, Joe soared into the sky in the form of a crow accompanied by dark smoke. Hunters began to look around and do not understand where Joe disappeared. Then the head ordered all the hunters to look for him, because he could not just take and disappear. Joe, in the form of a crow, continued to soar in the sky. Joe was interested in trying this skill, for judging by all the facts, he, in the form of a crow, has some bonuses to invisibility. Still, Joe decided to find out if the usual skills were available to him in this form. Joe Raven used his weakness detection ability, and his eyes abruptly lit up purple. Joe began to survey his surroundings. A red sight appeared on the guild head's hand, marking the poor man's weakness. Joe realized that the guild leader's hands were his weak point. Joe also realized that this was the reason why the guild leader wore gloves. Still, Joe decided to try the god's hand. Joe rushed down and charged his raven talons. He swept through the poor bald hunter, and after a moment left only light purple pixels in his feather. A system window appeared in Joe's subconscious that congratulated him for successfully stealing the blood prison contract skill. Joe could not believe that he had succeeded on the first try. All that remained was to understand how this skill worked. The head of the guild was not a bad guy. He felt that someone was flying near him, so he decided to do something about it. The guild leader focused his energy in his eyes, and his hands began to skid a bunch of scarlet energy. The guild leader himself began to use the skill, Sensation of Blood. Finally, the guild leader discovered that there was a crow flying above them. The guild leader realized that this crow was their beloved Joe. The red-eyed head pointed at the crow and ordered the others to kill it now. At this moment, Joe used the raven's signature ability. Joe began to be covered in a purple aura. Joe released many feathers in different directions. The feathers rushed downwards and were more like dark shots coated with purple energy. The head's allies were immobilized. The bald man himself concentrated the energy in his hand and said sharply, "Blood slaves, calling!" Baldy began to summon the nearest blood slave within a 500-meter radius and lifted it up with tentacles that appeared to be made of dark scarlet energy. This way, the bald man shielded himself from the hail of feathers. The crow's eyes began to light up purple. Joe stepped out of his crow form and charged his sword with purple lightning. The real Joe, coming out surprisingly, had huge wings. This was simply the greatest manhwa frame ever. Joe swept down with a sharp sword thrust and made everyone else scream as he used his sword to literally crush the ground. Joe was able to kill many of the bald man's henchmen who were now lying on the floor. The bald man turned to Joe and said that this brat was not so simple. The bald man began to charge his hands with scarlet energy and addressed Joe, saying, "And your equipment isn't bad either. I'll sell everything I pick up from your corpse and go gold." A system window appeared in front of Joe and notified the surrounding people that this was a Blood Darkness contract. A skill effect, and the Blood Master and Blood Slave share a life and can be resurrected as a walking zombie at any time. The bald man began to lift his allies by charging a strange orb into their chests. In this way, he was causing them to become zombies. Joe continued to observe the situation and how the bald man energized his allies and turned them into zombies. With this, Joe understood the meaning of how the skill worked. Baldy interrupted Joe's thoughts and said that Joe should stop, for he had changed his mind again. Baldy stuck out his tongue and said that he would make him the smallest and most miserable slave and then make him watch him swing Joe's swords. Yes, that bald man is the most confident bald man I've ever seen. In response, Joe let it be known that the bald man's actions were a big mistake. Joe's eyes continued to burn red, the blade charging with purple lightning. Joe himself said, "Oh, you want my blades so badly." Then Joe informed him that when he got them, Joe would repay him with their steel in full. Joe began to charge the object in his hand. Yes, it was that teleportation bead. Joe opened the entrance to the hidden forbidden realm of the land of werewolves. Baldy continued to guide the zombies to Joe, laughing and saying that Joe had already pissed his pants. He asked a question. Did Joe think he could get away with it and successfully hide in the secret realm? Baldy starts running to the portal Joe opened and says he wants to see how far the bastard will run. The events move to the hidden forbidden realm, land of the werewolves. Joe is greeted by many werewolves who have noticed that this pathetic man has become a trespasser. Now the werewolves are going to kill him. The bald man started laughing at Joe and asked him, "Sick? Would you rather feed yourself to the dogs? Plagued to be my blood slave?" Baldy started laughing while Joe was already mentally replaying him. "You'll understand everything now." A level 40 werewolf commander with all the stats off the charts appeared in front of Joe. The werewolf commander turned to the humans, and with his huge blade, he assured that they would all pay for this mistake. Joe noticed that the werewolf had good stats, so he smiled and realized that this werewolf was the ringleader. Joe used the blood prison contract. His hand lit up and started to be covered with beautiful pixels. Joe began to pour energy directly into the werewolf's heart. So the system window appeared and notified Joe that the contract had been concluded. The werewolves kneeled before Joe and asked the Lord what he would order them to do. Joe pointed his finger at the bald man and his zombies, telling them to get rid of these trespassers. The werewolf immediately chortled and declared that everything would be done. His body began to be covered in a red aura. Baldy was, of course, shocked at this turn of events. He couldn't believe that such a snot could use his skill. Joe, already in the form of a raven, soared overhead and began to control the werewolf commander, forcing him to rush into battle against the humans. Joe was also helping the werewolves by feathering his feathers and immobilizing their opponents. The werewolves were already enjoying the delicious human meat. The werewolf tripped one of the hunters, which was the bald man. The werewolf was already looking at his next target with gusto, and Joe flew over the bald man and watched. The bald man started begging Joe for mercy, saying that he would give him everything he had. In response, Joe in his raven form began to glow violet, and then he dispersed his magic and sat on the werewolf commander's shoulders and asked him a question. "Don't you want the sword of Damocles already?" Joe decided to help the bald man a little. He created a huge stream of energy that rushed down from above at the speed of light and created a purple explosion. The werewolves began to eat the human meat, and Joe began to put his sword back in, and then Joe headed back to the purple portal. Joe started to exit the portal in some alleyway while in the city. The system window notified Joe that he had equipped the item Jinx Mask, so Joe could now change his appearance and nickname. Joe entered the nickname "Don't Piss Off the Crow" and then pressed ready with his finger. Zing! Joe's new nickname was now saved. Somehow Joe had already changed his clothes. Joe was now a super nerd. Joe said it was getting late, so he decided to go back home. Joe walks a little further away and turns his head and notices Yu Yu outside the coffee shop. Yu Yu is begging Mo Lin to join their Scorpion Guild because she has awakened a rare witch's profession. Yu Yu keeps holding the poor girl's hand and telling her that the conditions here are not quite the same as in this hotel. Joe immediately notices Yu Yu. Joe is surprised that this girl is trying to get someone into the guild again. Based on this, Joe turns into a raven and soars up above the girl. The two girls smile and say goodbye, but Joe continues to follow Yu Yu. He wants to find out what the girl is up to. Suddenly, Yu Yu starts to take off her clothes. Joe's raven form immediately turns red and lights up with purple energy. Yu Yu looks around sharply and asks, "Who's there?" Yu Yu's bright green eyes start to glow and she feels like someone is staring at her. Yeah, it's weird considering you're in the middle of a freaking street. The girl looks up to see a raven flapping its wing at her. Unfortunately, Yu Yu just covers up the most interesting shots. Yu Yu herself is outraged, saying that her killer instincts have never failed her before. Joe is surprised that she is an assassin, that is, the same class as him. The girl puts on a beautiful red dress. She carefully pulls the stockings on her legs and blushes a little. By the way, Yu Yu is on the second peak. She herself is level 40. Joe continued to hover above Yu Yu and watch her. He mentally reasoned in his head, assassins are the main force when it comes to attacking high-level monsters. Joe can't understand. How come she's just recruiting people into the guild? In this interesting shot, you might want to look a little closer. The bracelet on the girl's arm lights up, and Yu Yu immediately looks at her bracelet and says, Oh, the prey has taken the bait so quickly. A call comes through Joe's bracelet. It's the girl she was talking to outside the coffee shop. The girl turns to Yu Yu saying that she has decided that she wants to join the Scorpion Guild. Yu Yu is excited about the girl's call. She immediately shrieks that it's great. Yu Yu proposes to meet somewhere and make a contract. In that case, the girl agrees with Yu Yu, saying that she will come up with her geolocation right away. The satisfied girl starts to walk on and cheerfully sing along while the sly raven watches her. Joe tries to fly up to Yaoniming Hotel as fast as possible. He flies through many buildings. At this moment, a girl's light hand falls on the floor. The same girl with witch class falls on the floor being in a pool of blood. The girl asks Yu Yu, "Why?" Then the mad Yunogasai says that the reason is because there are so many people with rare professions that it's hard to call them rare anymore. After that, Yu abruptly closes the door and leaves the scene. At that moment, Joe realizes what is happening. Joe realizes that he is too late. Still, Joe captures that Yu handled it so quickly and ruthlessly. Joe realizes that the girl is definitely not just doing guild recruitment. Joe realizes that if he had fallen for her seduction ploy, he would be in that dead girl's shoes right now. Joe Raven starts calling her little sister's phone abruptly and mentally asks her to come to the phone soon, begging all the gods that nothing should happen to her. Meanwhile, somewhere at the hot springs, Shin Yu is having a high time with his girlfriend. A white-haired girl in a purple swimsuit sort of hugs Shin Yu and is about to kiss her. The girl is also surprised that they haven't seen each other for a few days, and her mounds have grown. At this moment, they are interrupted by a phone call. Xiao Yu, the girl with white hair, hugs Xing Yu and rests her eyes on her, asking Xing Yu not to answer. Xing Yu asks Xiao Yu to stop, saying she's getting a phone call. Xiao Yu and Xing Yu are getting a little tense around Xiao Yu. Xiao Yu doesn't like the fact that Zhou is so mature and still clinging to his older sister. Xiao Yu says that at least he lived on his own at night. Still, Xing Yu suggests that it might be something urgent. In response, Xiao Yu rushes over to Xing Yu and starts hugging her tightly, saying with a smile that she forbids her girlfriend to be distracted by anyone else. Xing Yu then goes into a dominant phase and grabs Xing Yu's chin and asks her, "Xiao Yu, are you jealous of your brother?" A romantic atmosphere reigns around them, and that's the end of it. Yeah, that's quick. Very sad. I'll see you tomorrow sometime. At this time, Joe, in the form of a raven, continued to call his sister and realized that his sister has not answered for a very long time. Joe can't understand what she is doing there. Raven rushed after Yaya, who had already gotten into a car and started to leave the scene. Raven Joe mentally said to her, "If something happened to my sister, I will kill you with my own hands." Meanwhile, the events moved to the city filled with the light from headlights and the noise of cars moving to the White Emperor City's top affluent neighborhood. Joe began to watch Yaya from behind the trees as she tearfully sang a prayer to another dude who was also singing prayers for the final light that would change the world. It turns out they're all lackeys of the Church of the End. After the two pure faithful people calmed down, they sat down at the table where Yaya immediately grabbed a drink. At this time, the stranger addressed Yaya by the nickname Poisonous Scorpion. He also pointed out the fact that she had made a lot of noise killing people in White Emperor City, so a certain Bai Zheng has become suspicious. With a smile, Yaya said that there was nothing she could do about it, and now her underlings would be doing the killing until she found the Death Star that was Joe. As Joe watched the couple, he was surprised to learn that the Church of the End is one of the top 10 cults full of lunatic followers who want to destroy the world, and he is their main target. The stranger pointed his finger at Yaya and asked her, "What does killing a dozen newcomers who have awakened to rare professions have to do with her? What does the Death Star have to do with her?" Yaya, smiling and holding a glass with a drink in her hand, said that she was sure that Death Star was worth 12 rookies, because he had somehow gotten his hands on some forgotten treasure chest from Clash Royale. Joe at this time continued to eavesdrop on this conversation and marveled that he really deserved such praise. In that case, the stranger asked the snide Yu why they were so concerned about Death Star. Yaya sighed and replied that her superiors think Death Star is very likely to be their chance to resurrect the Lord of the End. Oh yeah, conspiracy theories. Yaya's sly eyes and evil smile made us realize that she doesn't care if their Lord is resurrected or not. Yaya's main goal is to get the forbidden treasure chest. The stranger was struck by lightning when he heard what Yaya was saying. The thing is that forbidden treasure chest can unlock legendary artifacts, and if you possess one, you can become the most powerful person in the world. If Yaya could have it, Bai Zheng in White Emperor City would be a nobody. The stranger began to charge his attack. He decided to take the chest from the Death Star on his own and overthrow the top. The stranger asked Yaya if she had any leads on the Death Star. Yaya immediately put a picture on the table, asking to find this guy named Zhou Yu. Yaya suspects that this is the Death Star. At this time, Zhou, who was watching them, was surprised and wondered, how did she know that? The stranger went on to say that this guy is unremarkable. Of course, the best thing he has is the parameter of beauty. Yaya was confused, pointing out the fact that Joe has immunity to charm. Based on that, Yaya was surprised to say that maybe he is even stronger than her. The stranger stated that he would find him. Also, the stranger realized that he had a sister, and they could start with her. Joe, in raven form, continued to analyze and mentally state. Sure enough, Joe stated that he won't let cultists get away with this thought. At this time, a purple projectile flew at the crow. Joe managed to react and dodge the attack. The stranger asked Yaya what was wrong, when Yaya abruptly stated that the bird was following her all the way and looking at her in a strange way. At this moment, the stranger abruptly uses the Tower Shield skill. His hand lights up with scarlet color, and the stranger starts smiling. Whether you're birds or birds, you're all going to hell. The dome in which the criminal gang members were in was filled with a large red beam. The guards walking through the forest started to hear strange noises, but still scored. At this time, the stranger who activated Tower Shield called for an isolated battle zone to prevent external interference. The zone will hold for 30 minutes. The stranger himself became covered in a red aura, his eyes glowing red. Yu Yu turned to Zhao Jun and asked him if he was really stabbing her in the back right now. Zhao explained to Yaya that there was no one who would not want to get something good from the forbidden treasure chest. Raven Zhou watched all this and couldn't believe that these idiots had actually started fighting each other. Yaya used Poison Dragon Drill with a mad expression on her face. She put her fist together and created the semblance of a ghostly dragon head. Now there would be additional poison damage within a radius of 10 meters. Yaya asked the idiot, how could such a stupid warrior class thing stop an assassin like her? Yaya was convinced that she was stronger. The field was in chaos. Yaya created a huge dragon, and the raven started trying to fly away as soon as it realized it had to get out of there. Alas, Zhao was covered in a golden color and turned into gold, regaining his health and taking the damage. By the way, Zhao shouted to Yaya that he has awakened 3 times already, and he has 20 levels more than the girl. Yaya began to form matter in her hand and claimed that now she would personally teach him why defeat is called defeat. Yaya used Lightning Blast and rapidly began to move towards Zhao. Thus, she was so fast that the silhouettes of her body remained in the past where she was. In response, the angry Zhao hit the ground and aimed a projectile directly at Yaya. Yaya managed to jump up, and Zhou's raven approached directly towards them. In his pupil, Yaya was seen dodging rapidly. Zhou himself realized that calmness and flexibility in the face of danger. Is this the strength of a level 40 assassin who has awakened more than that 2 times? Yaya ducked and counterattacked, the cloud unfortunately blocking the view, and Zhao, in full gear, marveled at Yaya's speed. Yaya lunged forward and with an angry face prepared her dagger, saying that if she wasn't good enough, the church wouldn't have put them in charge of her meeting. The battle was going on at full speed. In the end, Yaya made an angry face and rushed at the poor guy, while Zhao managed to block the crazy girl's attack at the last moment. Zhou jumped forward, realizing that he must take advantage of this opportunity. Raven immediately began to use his Death Crow skill and released 72 feathers nearby. Feathers, of course, began to scatter across the battlefield. Of course, the 2 fools scattered, and Zhao turned around and looked at the crow, not realizing if she was here to help him. Zhao also couldn't understand if the Zhao family kept any crows. Zhao also remembered that a lot of rich people in the neighborhood pick up monsters and raise them themselves, but Zhao couldn't understand what type of pet this crow was. At one point, a feather flies into Yaya and pierces her, causing her to be debuffed and unable to move for 10 seconds. Zhao starts laughing furiously, and turning around, he rushes towards Yaya, shouting that this little friend is proving to be quite useful. Then Zhao strikes a huge sword directly at the girl. Naturally, Yaya is angry because it damaged her dress and reduced its durability by 50%. The debuff on Yaya was over, so she grabbed the blade and with an angry face let everyone know that she was going to bury him. In an instant, Yaya creates multiple slashes across the battlefield and blows Zhao to smithereens. The crow realizes that this is too bad because he only hit her once, and the difference in their levels of 40 will make a difference if anything happens. Yaya turned to Zhao and pointed out in a commanding tone that Zhao was a traitor because the crow had been chasing her for a long time. So he had been planning an assassination attempt on her for a long time. In response, Zhao called her a stinking mop. Zhao also shouted sharply and said that if she hadn't threatened the safety of the children of the Zhao family, back then he would have never colluded with her. Zhou also realized that Yaya thought he was this dude's pet. Yaya's evil eyes abruptly filled with purple-colored charm, and a wicked smile, she used charm. Zhao himself smilingly pointed out the fact that charm only worked on players, but Yaya smilingly stated that this beautiful crow now belonged to her. Zhou realized that this was an opportunity to trick them and make things more chaotic. Yaya asked her baby to hit Zhao. Based on that, Zhou used the signature ability again, but Zhao was able to escape by using Tower Shield. Fortunately, Zhou hit Zhao and was able to immobilize him for 10 seconds. Yaya was able to strike and lower Zhao's armor strength by 30%, and this happened within 2 seconds of being hit by Zhou's feather. Still, Yaya was confused by the raven's cunning rise above her. The raven started to use many feathers to attack, and Yaya, with an angry face, was surprised that this raven did not get hit by the girl's charm. Zhao, leaning on his sword with an evil smile, laughed and said that he had already pointed out to her that this skill only worked on players. Yaya and Zhao rushed into battle. Zhao himself shouted that he would take the forbidden treasure chest. Yaya, with an evil face, asked the idiot to start dreaming. Zhou himself opened his mouth in surprise and then started shooting feathers at them again, saying that he would not let them survive tonight. Meanwhile, in Zhao family house, main on trace, 2 employees were talking to each other. They were discussing whether or not Mr. Zhao was sleeping, when at that moment everything around them started to shrink and shake. A huge beam of light appeared in the distance, and the servants couldn't understand what the hell was going on. 3 minutes ago, Yaya and Zhao locked their blades and tried to make each other stop by insulting each other in every possible way. Of course, Zhou caught the opportunity, and while both of his opponents were filled with anger, he released his feathers and rushed forward. Zhou appeared, and covered by the effects of the transformation, he used Death Eye. Both of his opponents immediately felt a strange feeling of terrifying, murderous auras. Zhao looked at Zhou's face and realized that this rat was wearing a mask to hide his identity. The huge cut of the sword created unwavering destruction across the battlefield. Moreover, the impact was so strong that it created the semblance of a huge beam from space, destroying everything around him. After his evil deeds, Zhou landed nearby and took off his mask and wondered if they were dead. Instead of their cozy place, all that was left was a hole in the ground with Zhou sitting on top of it and just looking down. Zhao started cursing, saying that if he didn't have this necklace to protect him, he would have died by now. Zhao turned and looked at Zhou, mentally marveling that one lunge and he almost killed him. A IV-60 shield warrior. Based on that, he is already about level 80. Yes, you heard right about Zhou. At this time, Yaya lay in a damn hot pose and wondered what kind of swordsman it was, for his figure was damn familiar to her. At that moment, Zhou's gaze swiftly went in the other direction. From nowhere nearby appeared an unknown man in glasses, and he was using the skill Heavenly Barrier. This is a unique skill for the Magicka Knife 4 class, of which is 100. Lay down a barrier prison that 100% locks all attribute professions. In response, Zhou only smiled and used 10 steps, 1 fatal strike, X10 combo. This way, he created many cuts that in an instant caused the barrier to brightly disintegrate with energy and shatter. At this moment, the unknown man with glasses was surprised because in the past, his barrier could block attacks from a high-level boss. The nerd landed in front of Zhou and wondered what kind of weapon was immune to barrier magic and did 100% real damage. It was Zhou who laughed a bit with the stranger and said that he was trying to save a member of the Church of the End, so he must also be a cultist of the Church of the End. Zhou himself continued to be filled with energy and stood in a fighting stance. The unknown man could not understand what cultists Zhou was talking about, at which point Zhao immediately ran up and started talking to them, exclaiming that it was nonsense, for the Zhao family is a major taxpayer in White Emperor City. They are local to the city lord. They don't know how they could have anything to do with the Church of the End. The cunning Yaya was about to crawl away from the scene when Joe sharply pointed his sword at her and said that according to his information, this girl is a poisonous scorpion. She is also the one who killed 3 people with a rare profession. These words shocked the girl. Then the important man with glasses turned to Zhao and asked him to explain why the poisonous scorpion was in his house. Zhao almost lost his jaw at this. Zhao immediately knelt down and asked the four-eyed man to forgive him. For it was all his fault. He had bred and housed the wolf in his house, and he didn't know that this girl was a cruel cultist who kills in the blink of an eye. The unknown man with the evil face turned to Yaya and asked her if she had anything to say. In response, Yaya started laughing and spreading poison around. Like a paladin's sky, she claimed that she was the one who killed those losers. And then the girl started laughing. Everything around them began to be covered in purple smoke, and Yaya called the boys young gentlemen. This is the Void Seal skill, whose effect is void-based item. Leave a void mark in a safe area. And when in danger, use the seal to transport yourself to the mark. Four Eyes used his skill and shouted for her to come back. A dark turquoise sphere appeared in the glasses man's hands, and then everything started to flow toward him. A huge explosion appeared at Yaya's place, accompanied by light purple effects. In turn, Joe managed to turn into a raven and fly upwards. Glasses and Zhao opened their mouths wide as they realized that the swordsman had disappeared somewhere. Yes, you understood correctly that Joe had quietly fled. Meanwhile, the lanterns of the night city brighten it. And not only him. Under one lantern, Yaya in torn clothes and torn pantyhose is running somewhere and loudly expressing her discontent about stupid crows, stupid swordsmen. She insults him in every possible way. But when the raven appears behind the girl, she sees his shadow and opens her mouth wide, realizing that now she will actively answer for her words. The poor thread continues to hold the girl's huge dress, and Yaya asks the raven how he found her so quickly. Joe replies by saying that for a bird, all he needs to do is just fly high enough to see where she ran off to. Yaya, with a pitiful face, starts to turn to the raven and say that he's teamed up with the swordsman, isn't he? So why is he chasing her? In response, the raven made the most serious face and said that if people don't offend him, he won't offend them. But if anyone offends him, he will repay them tenfold, 100-fold, 1,000-fold. Ha! This dumbass really thinks the raven is not Yaya funny. This time, the raven won't let Yaya get away with the crime, so he uses his signature ability, and now many feathers are flying at the disgruntled Yaya. Meanwhile, it's full night. Sister Joe sits in the kitchen at the table and pouts her lips, waiting for something. Suddenly, the sister abruptly turns to herself and asks, "Why hasn't little Yi Joe returned yet?" She already thinks that he is in his room with a girl doing something. At this time, there are indeed some sounds outside the door. Sister Joe realized that he usually returns at this hour, so she immediately got up from her chair and headed for the door. But suddenly, a man burst through the door, and then poor Joe fell on the watermelons of Sister Joe. The worried sister asked her brother, "Little Joe, what's wrong with you?" Suddenly, a man appeared behind Joe who brought 2 girls with him and turned to Joe saying that only one of these girls would survive and he should choose now. Joe immediately rushed towards his sister. He began to pull his hand in panic, cold sweat running down his face. He had picked the right watermelons. Joe's eyes continued to open wide until he placed his hand on yet another hilt of his sister's white-haired girl. Joe immediately asked why she was even in his room. His sister's girlfriend immediately called Joe a freak and asked him how he wanted to die. And how dare he do that to his sister's friend like that? Joe continued to melt in the furnace. I mean, looking into the eyes of the crazy girl in fear of her. At that moment, Joe's sister walks into the room wearing an apron and smilingly asks little Joe if he is awake. She asks him to come down for lunch until she notices that Joe and the white-haired beauty, Tsundere, are arguing with Joe and blushing standing right above him. Sister Joe misunderstood everything, so she smiled and filled up when she saw such a picture. She was surprised that little Joe was so close to her friend. Moreover, she guessed she was right to ask little Yu to help take care of girl. In response, the white-haired Tsundere corrected the situation and more. Tsundere sighed heavily and glared at Joe, saying that he was just a little brat who still calls for his elder sister in his sleep. Joe replied with an angry face, telling the blonde to get out of here now. Afterward, all three of them were already sitting quietly at the table eating their meals. Blondie turned to Joe and asked what kind of bad things he had done last night. Xingye was worried about him all night. Joe made both girls blush by saying that he also liked to ask his sister what she was doing last night. She wasn't answering phone calls and she didn't reply to her text messages either. With such a clever move, Joe was able to get an extra chicken. Yes, we all know what you bloody pranksters were doing. Joe, with a serious face, held the chicken leg with his chopsticks and turned to the girls asking what they both did last night. This kind of thing made the girl a little shocked. The atmosphere around was filled with embarrassment, and the blondie stated that it was none of his business. So why couldn't the president and vice president meet after hours to discuss tactics? Yes, tactics. Joe, in response, continued to smile and sarcastically said, well, so it's business hours. Joe pointed his wands at the girls and asked them what kind of secret realm would require him, the Starlight Guild, to spend all night discussing tactics as if preparing for a powerful battle. Two girls at the same time with the most serious face said that it was the shadow of the Black Sun, a dark eclipse amidst a multitude of dead. That secret realm is 5 times the size of an ordinary secret realm and is filled with super heavy, powerful corpses and a corpse king with extremely thick blood volume. Although it's only IV 45, a lot of guilds have already folded in it. The blonde kept on saying that combining the accounts of the survivors who escaped and their rewards for passing that level, she suspected that the boss of that secret realm isn't the so-called corpse king at all, but someone else. Joe was immediately delighted by this news. He asked what was the point of there's a hidden boss in that secret realm. He also tried to find out how the rewards are, and if this boss really hasn't been passed yet. In response, his sister, with an angry face, told him the facts and said that he could not go to the shadow of the Black Sun with them because it was too dangerous. Then the kind sister started to stroke his head and tell him to be a good boy. The sister will surely bring something interesting with him. Look at that demon blondie who's watching the whole thing. Then the evil blonde pushes them away and says that she is the president and she decides what to do. While the two lesbians were hugging, Joe started to think about the shadow of the Black Sun and the fact that there is a boss who is hidden from others. Joe intends to get there by any means and see him for himself. At this time, the quest NPC is sitting in his room and discussing something on a piece of paper. One of the people informs him that Poisonous Scorpion is dead, Xiaojun. From now on, he, Scorpio, will replace her as his contact. The bearded, sullen man turned around and asked, dead? The man could not believe that she was really dead. The stranger stood up abruptly and threw his jacket back on. The man could not believe it, for he was convinced that she had been in perfect conditions the last time she left him. How could she have died? Scorpio was embarrassed and said the murder was very strong, causing 100% true damage and killing a second-level assassin in one blow. He'd already found out everything. Nothing could save her. Now it was Scorpio's turn.